Welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. If you're listening to this show, then you know that I value the value of podcast, and you're probably a fan of podcasts in general too. I really hope you're a fan of this one. For a lot of people in brands, though, they need some help to find the right kind of guest in order to fit their audience on their shows. So where would someone like that go? Tom Schwab is the Chief Evangelist Officer of Interview Valet, a leader in podcast interview marketing. And he's a subject matter expert on helping podcast brands use targeted podcast interviews to talk directly to ideal customers. And on this episode, we'll discuss some tips and strategies for finding guests for your show, how to leverage the right kind of guests for targeted audiences, the commitment needed to do a show, how to pitch yourself to be on other podcasts, Kalamazoo, Pat Flynn, podcast movement, and a lot more. So let's tune into an interview valet with your valet shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. You know, first of all, I heard that you were in the Navy. Is that right?
That is true.
In the Naval Academy.
Yes, and
Even
thank
more
you
impressive.
to all the U.S. taxpayers for paying for my education.
Well, first of all, thank you for your service. But second of all, how did you go from U.S. Naval Academy to Interview Valet? What was the inspiration? Tell us a little bit about your career and background from Navy to Interview Valet.
You know, I never would have guessed it when I graduated in the late 80s. But then again, we didn't know what the internet was, much less podcasting. But as I look back, it all makes sense, right? Life is an evolution, not a revolution. So I went to school as a mechanical engineer. You know, nuclear power, running nuclear power plants on an aircraft carrier was my first job out of college. But it really taught me that anything can be systematized, it can be refined, it can be improved, it can be taught. And so my commitment was up just about the time that peace broke out in the world. Remember when the evil empire, the Soviet Union broke up? So I looked at it
Tear
and I
down
said,
that
I've
wall.
done everything. Yeah, everything I've done, I wanted to do in the Navy. So I went from there to corporate America, was an engineer, then got into operations, distribution, sales, and marketing. And at the time, in hindsight, it reminds me of what we did in the Navy, where you do a different job to get ready for ultimately what you were going to do. And that was being a skipper of a ship. Now it's, being an entrepreneur. So I had had a distributorship here in Michigan, just about the time that Michigan led the country into the Great Recession. And the manufacturer thought,
Sure.
we should cut out the middleman, go direct. And it made a whole lot of sense until you look into the mirror and you realize, hey, I'm the middleman. And they did all right by me, buying back the distributorship. But we had a sideline business that we were doing well with in Michigan. But we thought, could we make a bigger impact? And, as we went into 2008 in the recession, I didn't want to build a regular brick and mortar. So I had read a book by two smart guys out of MIT, Dharmesh Shah and Brian Halligan, called Inbound Marketing. They went on to found HubSpot. And they talked about using the internet to help people, to attract, to engage, and delight. And so we were one of their early e-commerce customers. Beretta USA was their first case study. We were their second case study. And great time. We built it up from a regional player to a national leader, sold it off. And then about 2014, I was helping a few buddies down in Nashville when I was in my sabbatical phase. And they said, can you help me with my digital marketing? And I'd ask them to write a blog, and it was like a homework assignment for them. Most entrepreneurs, most business people don't like to do this, but they love to talk. And at that time, I wondered, could you use podcast interviews much like we used to use guest blogs? So instead of me putting a blog up on my own site, getting it seen by three people, one of them being my mom, go out on a podcast, on a blog, Huffington Post, Wall Street Journal, post it there. And so we started to test that on podcast interviews. Shark, I was amazed how well it converted. And at first I thought, it's a personality, it's a niche. So we kept refining it, kept testing it. I wrote a book on it that sold really well. And I even did a course, but I never took the course out of beta because people came back to me, the ones that were honest, and said, you've given me the cookbook, you've given me the videos, I want to be the guest, you take care of all the rest. So that's what we started to test in the end of 2015. We beta tested it. It worked so well that we took it out of beta in early 2016. We've now grown to a company of 18, all based in
Wow.
North America, but not everybody wants to live in Kalamazoo, Michigan with me. And we serve about 90 to 100 clients. So it
Nice.
makes sense, but only in the rearview mirror.
Well, I remember Russ Henneberry, who was an early guest. He was one of the co-authors of Digital Marketing for Dummies. He said the same thing about if you ask me to write, a 3,000 word blog, then I'm paraphrasing, but he said something about it being like a homework assignment and a lot of work. But if you get me on a podcast or an interview by phone, it's very easy, and couldn't agree more. But was your background at all in radio or blogging before? I mean, you were doing medical device sales for a while.
Yeah, what I was doing when I was selling, it was relationship sales.
Yeah.
So selling to orthopedic surgeons, selling to hospitals. So had no radio background. People that look at me say I've got a face for radio, but that's probably a different thing. But no, really, it's more of a marketing. And I think I've called myself at times an inbound engineer because I'm not a true marketer. I look at it more of the engineering
Hmm.
of how to design a system, how to double down on what's working and stop doing what's not.
Hmm.
We had a joke in the Navy that you have to be smart enough to know right answer when told. And I think the same thing goes for marketers, for business people, right?
Hmm.
Today, more than ever, our customers are telling us what they love and what they loathe. And we just have to listen to that data and double down on one and stop doing the other. I mean, early on with our programs, we went back and asked people what brings you the most value and what doesn't bring you value. And we actually cut out some of the parts of it that they said wasn't valuable to them and really doubled down on the things where they saw the most value.
Well, one of the things that you do that and your team does that's extremely valuable, and I'm sure you've heard this multiple times before because I'm hearing it from people that do podcasts now all the time, is the approach to podcasters matters a lot. It's kind of that customer experience, and your team and what I've seen so far, the way you've approached me, the way you've coordinated with me has been fantastically great and different than what you hear from other people who are trying to pay you for, to be on this show or that, and it's bad PR teams a lot of times. But talk about how you designed Interview Valet and to be a leader in this space that you're showing yourself to be.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my focus has always been on being different, not being better. And so, somebody asked me, what do you think of, all the booking services out
Yeah.
there? And I'm like, well, the barrier to entry is so small. Anybody can call themselves a booking agency, and honestly, there's 700,000 podcasts out
Yeah,
there. You
exactly.
don't need help getting on a podcast. What you need help with is really what we call podcast interview marketing, getting on the right podcast, then using that to actually grow your business. And our clients are the guests, but our partners are the podcast hosts. And um, I always look at it and I welcome anybody into the industry that's trying to make the ecosystem better, that's trying to serve.
Hmm.
But when people are just robo pitching, I think that doesn't serve their client. It doesn't serve the podcaster. And so that's one of the things that we've always looked at. One of our values is in this digital age of automation, it's the personal touch that makes the difference. People remember how you make them feel.
Hmm.
And just because you can robo pitch doesn't mean you should. We've got a database right now of relationships with 3,500 of the top podcasters in the business, faith and Christianity, and health and nutrition and wellness spaces. But we don't robo pitch them.
Hmm.
We one of the things we track our team on is the percentage of yeses that you get, right?
Exactly.
So it's not about pitching people, it's about making the right introduction. And even if it's a no, that's fine, but find out why
Hmm.
so it can get better. I was talking to Pat Flynn, and his assistant said they get pitched about 500 times a week to be on the
Oh
show, and
God.
they don't even look. And I felt bad. I only get pitched like twice a day to be on my show, and I don't have a podcast.
Yeah.
But each one of them starts, dear Tom, we love your show and would love to be a guest. It's like, if you're going to lie to me, don't tell me you love my show. Tell me I'm pretty or I look young.
Hmm. Well, for me, I'm always constantly amazed that the conversations we're having in hallways or conference rooms, the only difference we're doing that from now is there's a little bit of walk-in music, if you will, and then let's record a conversation. We know we're recording it, but I mean, you've been on 1,200 plus podcasts. Do you even have time to listen to podcasts anymore?
I do. And I listen to the first podcast of all our clients.
Good for you.
So
So you
with
can hear
that,
how horrible they were before you get to them.
no, actually, they with that, all of our clients go through this client success,
Yeah,
and part of the end of that is, it includes giving them the microphone so they sound great, teaching
sure.
them how to use it, that one sheet so that it's like a boiled down media kit.
Yeah,
But before they're blessed off to go on to podcasts, I have a practice interview with them because I want to give them feedback. If they've got if their first interview is going to be the worst, let's have it with me,
hmm,
and let's have it not the world here. But then once they do an interview, I listen to that. And one of the things that I love about it is I get to know more about our clients. And then also I get to listen to just different podcasts,
hmm,
ones that I never would have discovered. So yeah,
absolutely.
I'm an audible learner. I always say that I listen at 2x as I run at half x.
Well, then give some tips on how do you become the ideal guest. I mean, does somebody need to refine their message through sort of a narrow scope so that they can be that subject matter expert and offer that availability of something as a specific subject matter expertise? Is it more personality and behaviors that help somebody become a good guest? What are some of the things that you've seen that have helped people?
That's a great question. And I think we all are subject matter experts. We just don't know it. Right? The legal definition of an expert is someone who knows more by their training, their experience, than the average person. So, I'm an expert on Kalamazoo. If you were asking what should I do when I'm in Kalamazoo,
Sure.
I'd have expertise on that. You'd have it for Memphis. And so I think if we stay in our area of expertise, nobody asked me about politics because I don't care about my opinion on politics. That's not my expertise. But if you're working in a market, you're working that, 60, 80 hours a day, I'm sorry, a week. Your business, that expertise. If you've gone through a challenge, if you've written a book, if you speak, all of those things, if you're a consultant, you've got expertise in there. But that doesn't make you great just because you've got the expertise. I always tell people you have to be interested in
Very good
being
point.
interesting.
Yeah.
You have to want to have a conversation with somebody. Podcast interviews are a great place for people to get to know, like, and trust you.
Agreed.
They are an awful place to sell from. Nobody wants to hear an infomercial. So from that standpoint, be open to have a conversation. Um, we've struggled with this with some of our clients. There's certain people you ask, tell me about yourself, and 45 minutes later, they're wrapping
Exactly.
up.
Yeah.
The flip side of that too is we've worked with some people that have, big names on television, and they're used to a 2 or 3 minute segment. And so they talk in 30-second sound bites.
Right. Sure.
And it's like, we got to be longer than
Sure.
that, or this is going to be a painful interview. To me, the biggest thing though is what heart you come to the interview, right? Vaynerchuk talks about jab, 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 right hook. I always look at it as serve, 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 ask, right? So if you come with the heart to serve, so when you pitch a podcast host, it shouldn't be, I wrote this book, I'm selling this product, I want to use and abuse your audience. No, it should be, I've already connected with you. I've already served by sharing the episode. I've already served by liking it on social media, sharing it out. And then when you reach out, like we do, it's like we think that this person could serve your audience by offering this. DJ Doug Sandler from the Nice Guys on Business podcast. Love how he said it one time. He said, you don't have to promote yourself on a podcast interview. If you do a good job, I'll promote you better
100%.
than you ever could. So your goal on being on a podcast interview is to make the host look like a freaking genius for having you on that. Serve, add value. And if you do that, not only will you convert better, but you'll also be asked to be on other podcasts.
Absolutely. Well, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to make me look like a genius, Tom. So it may take a little bit extra. But one of the things I've seen so often, especially today, and I don't know if this is sort of indicative with almost like the rush towards influencer marketing, is so many people are running to, I get pitched 2-3 times a day minimum for my show, not 500 times a week, but a good dozen times a week, easy. People come to me and say that they want to be a guest on my show because they've seen some of the people I've had on, and they pitch themselves, but it generally looks too vague. Now, I don't think they need to be a zeroed in specific message, but I find so often that people are so broad they couldn't hit a barn, and that hurts their chances. Just like you do with speaker pitches. If somebody wants to speak at a conference, you can't speak to everybody. You've got to have some sort of focus, and I think that's what's really hurting a lot of the people that are just rushing towards that cattle call, if you will.
And technology is a wonderful thing, but technology amplifies your ignorance or your brilliance.
Yeah.
Right? Just because you can send out 1,000 emails with one click doesn't mean you should. And some people will say, well, I did 1,000 pitches and I got 5 yeses, and all I had to do was click one button. Well, those 5 yeses that you got are probably not shows you wanted to be on in the first place. And what harm did you do with all the rest of those? Did you have a chance being on that good podcast, but because you came to them in that way, they'll never take you. The other thing too is that, content is king, but context is God. So from that standpoint, connect the dots. Make sure you can tell them and that you actually listen to their podcast and say, this is why I would bring value.
Yeah.
My expertise, I believe that I'm a great guest and offer a lot in the marketing, small business, entrepreneurial space. That doesn't mean that I am a great guest for expectant mothers, right? They could have a great podcast, but I'm not a great guest for that.
Maybe not expectant mothers, but nuclear submarines you could.
Yeah, but we couldn't put it out there.
About that.
We'd have to kill everybody that listens.
That's true. So one of the things I read that you talk about that I wanted to kind of unpack a little further is, why do you think creating a podcast for somebody can be a huge mistake?
There's a push out there that everybody should have their own podcast.
Absolutely.
Once again, just because you can,
and then they record 3 episodes and quit.
Well, the data shows that most podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes.
Wow.
And it becomes a huge embarrassment. You go to all your friends, your customers, and say, I'm launching a new podcast. And they ask you a quarter later, how's it going? And you're like, oh, I killed that off. Or it's their first time on microphone. You don't want to practice on your own platform. Practice on somebody else's platform. I guarantee you, your first interview, your first podcast episode is going to be lousy, right? But you're going to get better with that. So a lot of times being a guest is a great way to find your voice. It's a great way to know whether or not you really like this before you make the commitment. And the other thing too, it's like when you start a podcast, and I just got back from Podcast Movement. It was down in Orlando, and a lot of the bigger people there were talking about, you may have missed the boat unless you've got a big audience. Pat Flynn was talking about it. John Lee Dumas was talking about it. There's so many podcasts out there. Your chances of hitting new and noteworthy and getting known are probably slim. It's probably better to tap into other people's audience. If you think about it, like writing a blog. If I launch a blog today, will everybody find it? Probably not. So what can you use? Guest blogging, guest podcasting. That's a great way to do it. And just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity. You talked about like, know, and trust, but it's a great opportunity for somebody to create dislike, know you for your worst faults, and trust you a lot less if you do it wrong. But that's, it's very interesting to hear somebody like Pat Flynn with the audience he has, or John Lee Dumas, either one of them. I find that very interesting that they, of all people, would be discouraging of podcasts. Why do you think they did that, though?
I think they're really focusing on guesting, because what worked 5 years ago doesn't always work today. It was a different time when there wasn't as many podcasts. You could put one up there and just put enough good content,
Yeah.
everybody would find you. It's a lot tougher right now. And if you've got an audience already, yeah, it's great to tap into there. But if you don't have that, you're going to have to find some other way to get in front of them. It's not if I build it, they will come. Um, Charlene Johnson was at Pete Vargas's event, Advance Your Reach, and she talked about a different thing, a similar topic of guesting. She built her audience probably 20 years ago with fitness videos. Now, if you did that today, it wouldn't stand out as much. And Shark, sometimes I think it's when people give advice, it's almost like me telling you when you go to the grocery store, go to aisle number 2 to check out because that is the one that moves the fastest.
Yeah.
Now, I'm trying to help you, but I'm talking about a different market at a different time. So you can't just copy the same thing. But if you can say, well, why did that work at that time? What things did you see? Then you can apply it to your market. But I think often we're trying to take the lessons that worked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and wonder why they don't work today.
It's Google Trend data. I see it all the time with speakers at conferences. They've read about or heard a story somebody else has told, and then they try to tell that story their own way. And some of that can be told better, but if they don't know it or don't understand it or haven't produced a podcast, it's hard to be somebody's going to consider an expert all of a sudden. When do you sort of feel, whether it's you or maybe not some of your guests, because you've been on well over 1,000 podcasts, when do you feel oversaturated with that message? And when should somebody who's wanting to work with Interview Valet, what's the kind of goal they should set? It's kind of a two-part question, but how many podcasts should somebody be on to sort of help get their name out there and spread that message?
Yeah, I don't know if you can be oversaturated. I think you can be boring if it's the same interview on each one. I've been on 1,200, and there's still people that are like, I've never heard this guy before. Obscurity is our biggest enemy. And I think more is not better. Better is better. So of those 1,200 podcasts, there's honestly, as I look back on it, we were developing the system. There's probably 400 that really moved the needle. And I got to talk with a lot of neat people, but we're trying to make sure that we get the most out of every one. So I think with that, having a focus, trying to talk about different subjects on different podcasts, so it's not the same one all the time, that can be very helpful. But to me, it's really more about being targeted, not just getting on. I want to get on a big podcast. No, I want to get in front of my ideal audience. And I think early on, I was on a podcast that had like 40,000 downloads. It was a great podcast, but it was very formulaic, very diverse audience, very aspirational audience. And from that, that's back when I was selling a digital product. And I probably got, 24 sales from that. And I was thrilled. But it was more of an ego stroke for me that I was on a big podcast. Shortly after, I was on a smaller podcast. I think the host said she had about 350 downloads per episode. I sold over 100 products on that. It's like there's more fish in the ocean. Okay, there's more sharks in the ocean than there are in a barrel. But, if you can find a barrel that's full of them, go there every time.
Well, and she maybe didn't know her real numbers, but to be honest, at least she said 350 as opposed to people who are pitching that they're getting 100,000, downloads per episode, and it's a bunch of malarkey. So I find it very interesting how so many podcasts are promoting their numbers when a lot of these guys don't even know what their numbers are.
And it's interesting that the data that came out at Podcast Movement a few years ago, Libsyn broke it down because, the download numbers aren't publicly available. The only people that know them are the podcast host and the hosting company. And by terms of service, the hosting company can't release individual ones. But they did do it for, for all podcasts. And it was really interesting. In 2017, they released that the top 1% of podcasts got 54,000 downloads per episode. And that actually dropped this year down to 47,000 podcasts. So you look at that and say, well, does that mean podcasting isn't as popular? It's like, no, it's more popular. But there's so many more
So
podcasts
much
out there to
noise out
choose
there.
from. It's democratized it.
Yeah.
So everybody's got their little podcast that they love.
Well, when you look at tips for brands, especially, but for podcasters who do start this up, unpack your thoughts, if you will, a little bit on ROI and what expectations should someone create. I did this, it was a personal love about marketing, trying to help people fix a lot of the things that I've seen either I've done or other people have done in marketing, and try to fix that marketing and advertising. But you know, if you're a brand and look at this differently, and like you just said, there's a huge rush out there right now telling everybody you got to go do a podcast, you got to go do a podcast. The ROI can change from an expectation level for a brand wanting to put out a message versus me wanting to put out an individual message. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think today we are so tied into analytics.
Yeah.
It's like, show me on the dashboard what the ROI is. And people ask me a lot, well, how do you define the ROI? I'm like, well, tell me what you value, right? Because we've got some clients that come to us just for the SEO value. Mm-hmm. That they will go on a podcast. And if you'd say, hey, do you want to go on the Tim Ferriss podcast, or do you want to go on a undergraduate podcast at Harvard University? Mm-hmm. That comes with a link that says harvard.edu.
Exactly.
I mean, that is so powerful. They'll go,
it's gold.
I'll go on that every day. Mm-hmm. So for them, that time to get that backlink is huge. Other ones are looking at it and saying, what are the sales that we can drive from this? And, mm-hmm. a lot of times we work with authors, speakers, coaches, consultants, brands, and a lot of times they don't do closed loop marketing. So they can't do their numbers. But I love working with software as a service companies, right? Because they know their numbers. They know the cost of lead acquisition, the cost of customer acquisition down to the penny. And they're the ones that come back to us and say, this makes total sense. This is some of the best revenue we have. Because after somebody listens to you on a podcast interview, they've self-selected. They're going to hear you. And I always say there's three types of people that hear me. Those that think I'm an idiot, right? And I don't disagree with them, but I know they wouldn't be a good customer. The other ones are, that's interesting, but I don't need it right now. The third ones are the ones that have listened to you for 30 or 45 minutes and they're ready to buy, mm-hmm. right? That is a hot lead. That's almost like a personal introduction. They've watched it. They've self-selected. So the return on investment on that can be great, especially when you figure out how pre-qualified they are, how fast they close. The other thing too is that if you look at podcasting is an investment, not a spend, right? So if I spend $1 on Facebook ads, I can tell you tomorrow what the ROI was on it because it's there, it's gone. Whereas this is evergreen content that will be out there. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we're doing a lot with also is we're testing, can you use one podcast interview and get a month's worth of content out of it? If you want to get more return on investment out of every interview, well, then mine that interview for everything it's worth. Take that hour's worth of the CEO's time and get the transcript, make blogs out of it, make memes out of it, make a speaker's reel out of it. There's so many things that you can do to amplify that. And so from that standpoint, you can really amplify the return on investment. And one of the things I always point to is the return on investment of time and money, right? Yeah. So this is a digital stage. I love speaking from stages, but when I start to look at it and go, wow, I will fly across the country and it'll take 2 days of travel time. And then I'll be there for a day and, to speak to 500 or 1,000 people. I'm like, that is great. But if you look at it, you jump on a podcast, there's no travel time. You can talk
it's good internet
wherever
connection.
You are.
Yeah.
Yeah. As long as you got a microphone and a good internet connection, you can talk to thousands, tens of thousands over time. And if somebody missed that conference, don't worry, send them the link. Yeah. They can listen to it later.
Knowledge to go. I mean, that's
right.
What podcasts are. Did you hear anything? I know some of the stats that I've seen, I think these were from Edison not that long ago, that 45% of podcast listeners today had a household income over $75K. And when you think of the audiences that we're all trying to sell to, it's generally that, A lot of people, it's a lot less than that. But 75K is a decent income through most parts of the country. But I don't know that enough people still to this date understand, especially brands, understand the relationship, the value of a relationship and what you build in a half hour or even 10 minutes on a show, how much more that's worth than just a click through to
And
something.
I agree with you on that. And also of who you're talking to, right? You're talking to
Exactly.
early adopters. So you're talking to the people that are want to try something new, want to invest something new. We had a client that told me, he's like, 20 years ago, if I walked into an executive's office, and he was going after C-level executives, and they had books on their
Yeah,
desk, he's like, I knew that was my kind of client. They're
exactly.
looking for answers. They want new things. They want to be the first to bring it to their industry, their community. And he's like, that was my ideal client. And we're seeing that same thing with podcast interviews. There's some people that listen to 80s rock all the time. God love them. I do that at times. But those are the people that are looking backwards and don't want to learn
Hmm.
anything more. Uh, you're talking on podcasts. It's people that are looking to be the newest, learn the newest ideas, take action. Man, that is a ripe audience right there.
Did you hear anything at Podcast Movement, or are you and your team seeing anything, especially with brands? Has this been more of a B2C play or more of a B2B play?
I think it's both, right?
Agreed.
And because
But
at
I'm
the
wondering
end
if
of
the
the
pendulum is moving in any one direction.
I would have to say it's probably moving more to the B2B side.
Mm.
You know, um,
Again, that's the value
this
of the relationships.
and also, 5 or 6 years ago, I remember going to Podcast Movement, and I joked that at that time podcasting was like Wayne's World, two guys in their mom's
Hmm.
basement. Brands weren't coming into it. This year at Podcast Movement, you saw Google, you saw iTunes, Spotify, ABC News was there with a booth on their podcast. So I think the B2B side is coming into it a lot more. The other thing is that years ago, HubSpot did a piece on about the founders page was had high correlation to people buying
Hmm.
because they want to know who the brand is, who they're working with, what this backstory
Hmm.
is. And I think that's sort of the new reality. If you want this long-term partnership with people, you need to reach out to them human to human. A great example is Gavin Zaglinski from Acuity Scheduling.
Hmm.
He was an early client with us when he was just starting to launch Acuity. Now, there's, Acuity, Schedule Once, Calendly, all the rest of it. Are they all the same? Is one better than the other? I really don't know because after I got to know Gavin and his backstory on,
Hmm.
on why he started it for his mom and why some of her friends started to use it and how he expanded it and how he builds his team and what
Sure.
his heart is behind it, I will use this Acuity Scheduling
Exactly.
forever.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason that he's got less churn and that he was the first acquisition in the space and the first acquisition that Squarespace did because there was a name, a face, a heart behind that brand. The other ones, I don't know. They could be from Bangladesh. I really don't know who they are.
I've heard you mention this on some of the other shows that I listen to, sort of in preparation. And I've heard this from other podcasters and speakers as well. But 100 years ago, when I was a millennial on the radio, and I've done radio throughout my career, but where do you want to see this go? I've heard a lot of people say that you hope this is where we hoped radio would go, but what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and that wasn't my idea. That came
I
from
think it's a brilliant
Harvard.
statement. I just don't know what that actually would look like.
It came from a keynote at
Yeah.
Harvard last year. Harvard did their first podcasting conference in 2018, and it was brilliant. They called it the golden age of podcasting,
Hmm.
and it was interesting because at Harvard it was put on by the Divinity School. And you're like, why would that be podcasting? And they called it the Ministry of Ideas. And when radio first came out, there was this understanding that wow, we could cut out ignorance, right? Because we can teach people over the radio. We can cut out bigotry because once people get to know each other, it's really hard to hate a person. We can cut out racism, sexism, whatever it is, and just this whole ministry of ideas. And I think that is one of the greatest things about podcasting. It's also the dangerous thing about podcasting is that you can listen to whatever you want, or you can listen to just what you want. So you
Hmm.
can listen to just everybody that agrees with me and proves that I'm right and everybody
Great
else is
point.
wrong. And that can be a really ugly place. Or you can listen to differing ideas, not to judge them, but just to say, wow, why do they think about that? Why do they think it that way? And that's one of the things I challenge people is listen to podcasts that you normally wouldn't. You don't have to
Exactly.
subscribe. You don't have to listen to every week, but if you're one side, listen to another one and just see why they think that. And that's one of the reasons I love listening to our first interviews with all of our different um, guests. Somebody asked me on a podcast one time, what was the last podcast you listened to? And I had to laugh. And I'm like, I listened to Adoption Now this morning. And there was just like this silence. And it's like, what is a 53-year-old man doing? And I'm like, one of our clients was on it. I
Right.
didn't know that you could adopt frozen embryos from in vitro fertilization. To me, it was like, that is really interesting. And so from that standpoint, today, if you're isolated or ignorant, it's largely by choice.
Absolutely.
You can listen to a podcast and learn something new or be connected with somebody new. And my fear is that by choice, we can continue to use podcasting to be isolated or ignorant.
Agreed. The power of it is just amazing these days. I mean, it does come with a lot of responsibility, but I think about just some of my most recent shows. I mean, getting here to talk to you, I just had a world record holder. On a previous show, I had a Golden Buzzer winner who's a friend from America's Got Talent who was just on the show. It's ridiculous the amount of connections and relationships you can build, and that's what translates into better sales, better lead generation, better everything else if it's done right. I mean, it's just amazing. So, Tom, it is way too cold even this time of year in Kalamazoo, but I've got to ask. I don't think you've been asked this on any other show, but what is your favorite kind of shark and why? Have you been
Oh,
asked that on any of your 1,200 interviews?
I have I have not.
Thank you. I
And I've
get
got an answer
ring
for
the
this
bell
one.
for that one though. Okay,
It's got to be the great white,
good man.
right? And the other thing that I love about sharks and that I resonate with them is that they got to keep moving. Um,
Absolutely.
you know,
Swim or
Patience
die.
is a virtue. It's not one that I have. My prayer is always, God, give me patience and give it to me now. But I'm always swimming. I'm always moving. I'm always learning. When that stops, I guess I'm like a shark, and I'll suffocate and either sink to the bottom or float to the top.
Well, you were talking about books on shelves. I don't know if you can see, but all the books I've got on my shelves, it's all half of it's sharks, comic books, martial arts and marketing stuff. So, well, Tom, it's that special time in the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
Let's do it, shark.
All right, number 1. You're an author and a podcast subject matter expert, an author with an expertise on podcasting. So my question is reading or listening?
Listening. I feel like I'm lying when I say I read 2 books a week because I'm actually listening to them.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll just up the Audible subscription one more time. Number 2 for a Navy man, Crimson Tide with Denzel Washington or The Hunt for Red October with Sean Connery and Alec Baldwin.
I've got to go with the Hunt for Red October.
Yeah.
Even though I was on an aircraft carrier, that is just, you can't get better than Sean Connery.
No, I could have given you an aircraft carrier and given you down Periscope with Kelsey Grammer, but I didn't want to be mean. So you mentioned him earlier, but let's here's a Wayne's World question: Wayne or Garth?
Oh, it's got to be Wayne.
All right,
Party time.
party time. Number 4, a Kalamazoo question: Greg Jennings of the Minnesota Vikings or Derek Jeter of the New York Yankees? They both graduated from Kalamazoo High School.
Both are amazing men. I would say all of the above there. What they have done for our community is amazing, and it's funny. You walk around Kalamazoo, you see more Yankees jerseys, and you saw more Green Bay Packers jerseys, and I think that's a testament to the men.
Absolutely. Number 5, and the most important question you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
Cornbread.
Good man. All right. So, Tom, where can people find out more about you, about Interview Valet, and how to get, engage with this wonderful brand?
Well, thank you for letting me be here. And one of the things we've learned from all of our testing is don't send people to your homepage. Don't send them to LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all the rest of that. Make
Right.
what we call a welcome page. So
Yeah.
if you go to interviewvalet.com/shark, you're going to see the best
Boom.
example of what our testing has shown. So on there, it's a custom homepage. You're going to see the shark's picture. You're going to see the trust seal of the artwork, and then I'll put some things down there. Another one of our testing showed that give people a chance to meet you where they are. So I'll put a checklist, everything that we use that we've learned on that, and getting ready for your first interview. That book that we talked about, I sell some, but I give away more. If you want a free book, just go there. And then finally, if any of this made sense to you, if you want to talk about how you could leverage targeted podcast interviews, how you could use podcast interview marketing, just go back to interviewvalet.com/shark. I'll put all my contact information there too, so you don't have to figure out which Tom Schwab in Kalamazoo, Michigan it is.
There you go. Thank you so much, Tom, for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Thank you.
So there was my conversation with Tom Schwab, the Chief Evangelist Officer of Interview Valet, a leader in podcast interview marketing, and he's a subject matter expert on helping podcast brands use targeted podcast interviews to talk directly to ideal customers. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, there are a lot of podcasts out there, but for people who want to appear on one or more, as Tom explained, it's about being on the right ones to grow your business, not just spray and pray and skip the robo pitches. It's like bad salespeople on LinkedIn. We've all seen those types of messages. If you're pitching yourself to a podcast show, then ask yourself, what value do you bring to the host? And more importantly, to their audience, which needs to be a targeted one. As he said, more is not better, better is better. Look, I get pitched quite a few times every week by people who basically push their air quotes features and benefits, just like companies do. It doesn't work for brands and it doesn't work for guests. And I, as a host, have to be careful as well. I have some of the most amazing friends and top influencers on this show, and I could not be more grateful to them for appearing as guests. But I also have to be very respectful of their time, and I always hope to show them the value of our time together. Second, so what is the perfect podcast guest expert? Well, Tom again gave some great advice as someone who's been featured on over 1,200 shows. I love when he said that just because you have the expertise doesn't necessarily make you a great guest. That's so true. There's always a value to great information. However, it also needs to be infotaining to the listener. As Tom said, and I quote, "You have to be interested to be interesting. You have to want to have a conversation with me or whoever the host is." And he went on to remind us that these are a great place for someone to get to know, like, and trust you. They're not a place to sell. If you add value, then trust me, it will attribute in some form back to you later. Third, so should you start your own podcast? There's a rush by people all over advising everyone to start one. Well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. He mentioned something about how most podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. And you could really have egg on your face or your brands if you don't make a true commitment on the front end. Podcasts stand out a little more than blogs, especially today. So when it fails louder. He went on to say, before you do, appear on other shows to get the feel. That's great advice. Just remember that the world doesn't necessarily need another podcast or blog, and what worked 5 years ago doesn't necessarily work today. Just set your expectation level right, and it can still work for you. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you for the privilege of your time. So if you can't be more better, then be mo better, and always tip your valet. So join us in the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.